She thought she was above the law. She mocked him, insulted him. Then he pulled out an arrest warrant, with her name on it. The courtroom was packed, not a single seat left. The air was heavy, not just with the scent of polished wood and old law books, but with something else, tension. People weren't here for the case. They were here for the judge. Judge Katherine Whitmore had a reputation. Some called her sharp. Others called her ruthless. But there were plenty who called her something else. Unfair. Especially to people like Detective Brian Foster. He sat on the witness stand, his posture straight, his face unreadable. He'd been through this before, testifying in cases, presenting evidence, answering questions. But today felt different. Not because of the case. That was routine. A drug possession charge. The kind of thing that moved through the system like clockwork. No, the real reason today was different sat just a few feet away from him, wearing a black robe and a permanent smirk. Judge Whitmore leaned forward, adjusting her glasses as she eyed him like he didn't belong there. "Detective Foster," she said, dragging out his name like it was an inconvenience. "Before we waste any more time, let's get one thing straight. Your testimony is based on what? Your expert opinion." Her voice was like a slow-acting poison, laced with condescension. Brian didn't flinch. He'd heard worse. "With all due respect, Your Honor," he said calmly, "I'm testifying based on evidence collected at the scene. Facts, not opinion." Whitmore scoffed. "Facts." She leaned back, tilting her head. "And we're supposed to believe that you, what was it, 10-year detective?" 14, Brian corrected, keeping his voice even. She smirked. 14 years. And in those 14 years, you suddenly developed the ability to read minds. There were a few chuckles from the defense table. Brian kept his face neutral. "No, Your Honor, just the ability to investigate." The smirk disappeared. She didn't like that. "Let's be honest here," she continued, her voice sharpening. "Officers like you, well, let's just say some of us have learned not to take your kind at face value." Silence. A heavy, deafening silence. People shifted in their seats. A few eyebrows raised. Even the defense attorney, who had been grinning a moment ago, suddenly looked uncomfortable. Brian let the words sit. He'd learned a long time ago that reacting too fast, too strong, was exactly what people like Whitmore wanted. Instead, he met her gaze. "My kind, Your Honor." Whitmore waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, don't play the victim, detective. I'm just saying what everyone's thinking. Let's stick to the case and keep personal bias out of my courtroom." Personal bias. The irony was thick enough to cut. But Brian wasn't here for a fight. He had a job to do. What the judge didn't know, so did he. And she was about to find out just how well he did it. But first, she had more to say, more rope to give herself before the real reckoning began. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, low but undeniable. People exchanged looks. The clerk shifted uncomfortably in her chair. The bailiff, arms crossed, stared straight ahead, his jaw tight. But Judge Whitmore? She looked pleased. She tapped her pen against the desk, eyes locked on Brian like a predator watching prey. "Detective, let's not waste everyone's time. We both know cases like these are built on assumptions." Brian inhaled slowly. He wasn't going to let her drag him into whatever game she was playing. "No assumptions, Your Honor. The suspect was caught with 200 grams of fentanyl. That's not personal use. That's trafficking. And the evidence speaks for itself." She raised an eyebrow. "And you're certain the arresting officers handled the case properly? No unnecessary force? No misplaced evidence?" Brian recognized the tactic. She wasn't questioning the case. She was questioning him. "With all due respect, Your Honor," he said, keeping his voice steady, "are you suggesting the officers involved acted improperly?" She smiled. A slow, deliberate thing. "Oh, I'm not suggesting anything, Detective. Just making an observation." A pause. Then she leaned in, voice dropping just slightly. "After all, we've seen cases like this before, haven't we? Certain officers seeing what they want to see, filling in the blanks with their own perspectives." The words hung there, heavy and sharp. She wasn't just implying bias. She was making it clear. She didn't trust him. Not because of his record, not because of his experience, because of who he was. A low cough from the prosecution table. Even the defense attorney, clearly enjoying the show, had the good sense to look down at his notes. Brian let the silence stretch. Then, carefully, he said, "If you have a problem with how the case was handled, Your Honor, I'd be happy to walk you through every step of the investigation." Whitmore laughed. Actually laughed. "Oh, no need, Detective," she said, waving him off like he was a waiter bringing the wrong order. "I'm sure you believe you did everything by the book, but let's not pretend every officer who takes that stand is a saint." More murmurs. Someone whispered something too low to hear. The tension in the room had shifted from uncomfortable to electric. Brian could feel it. Everyone could. She wasn't trying to hide it anymore. Judge Whitmore wasn't just dismissing his testimony. She was dismissing him. And it wasn't the first time. This was who she was. The kind of judge who thought the bench made her untouchable. The kind who let the mask slip just enough to remind people where she stood. But Brian wasn't here to argue. He wasn't here to plead. He was here for something bigger. And the clock was ticking. But Judge Whitmore wasn't done humiliating herself just yet. She had a little more rope to pull before it all snapped back in her face. Judge Whitmore leaned back in her chair, her smirk widening. She was enjoying this. The power, the control. She thought she had the upper hand. "Tell me, Detective," she continued, her voice light, almost playful. "When you walked into this courtroom today, did you think your word alone would be enough to convict a man?" Brian tilted his head slightly, watching her. She was setting something up. "I don't expect my word to be enough, Your Honor," he said evenly. "That's why we have evidence." She chuckled. "Oh, evidence." She turned to the jury, shaking her head as if she'd just heard something ridiculous. It's funny how that word gets thrown around so easily these days. There it was. Whitmore wasn't attacking the case. She wasn't even attacking him anymore. She was attacking the very idea that the police, certain police, could be trusted at all. Brian took a slow breath, his fingers resting lightly on the witness stand. "I'd be happy to walk you through the details of the arrest, Your Honor," he said, his tone measured. "Or is there something specific you're questioning?" Whitmore gave a little sigh, shaking her head like he'd disappointed her. "Detective, I'm simply saying that in my years on this bench, I've seen my fair share of, let's call them, questionable testimonies." The meaning wasn't lost on anyone. The room was silent again, that kind of silence that made people hold their breath. Even the defendant, who, by all accounts, should have been thrilled to see a detective getting grilled, looked unsure about what he was witnessing. Brian didn't react, not yet, because he wasn't here to prove anything to Whitmore. He was here for something else entirely. Whitmore glanced at the prosecution table. "You don't seem very concerned about this," she said, addressing the ADA. "I'd assume a real prosecutor would have more questions about how this case was handled." The ADA, a young woman in her early 30s, shifted in her chair but said nothing. Smart. She knew when not to get involved. Whitmore sighed dramatically, then turned her gaze back to Brian. "Honestly, Detective, I don't even know how you made it onto the force." And there it was. The courtroom erupted. Gasps, whispers, a few outright muttered curses. Even the stenographer's fingers hesitated on the keys. Brian stayed perfectly still. Whitmore, for the first time, seemed to realize she might have gone too far. Just slightly. But she didn't back down. She never backed down. She straightened her shoulders, eyes locking with Brian's. "Let's keep your opinions out of my courtroom," she said firmly. Slowly, Brian nodded. "All right," he said. He reached into his jacket pocket. Whitmore's smirk returned, just for a second. She thought she'd won. She thought she'd shut him down. Then Brian pulled out a folded piece of paper. He opened it, smoothing it out carefully on the stand. When he looked up, his expression was unreadable. But his next words sent a shockwave through the entire courtroom. "Actually, Your Honor," he said calmly, "I was trying to be professional. But now it's official." A pause. Then, "You're under arrest." The entire courtroom froze. Whitmore blinked. The color drained from her face. But she hadn't even begun to understand just how bad this was for her. For the first time that afternoon, Judge Whitmore didn't have a response. Her lips parted slightly, her eyes darting between Brian and the paper in his hand. Then she laughed. It was short, breathy, forced. "Excuse me?" she said, her voice dripping with disbelief. Brian held her gaze, his expression calm. He wasn't playing a game. He wasn't bluffing. He unfolded the paper fully and read aloud, his voice steady. "Katherine Whitmore, by order of the State Bureau of Investigation, you are under arrest for obstruction of justice, bribery, and conspiracy to commit fraud." Dead silence. A ripple of shock moved through the room. The bailiff, who had been standing stiffly by the judge's bench, took a half-step forward, his expression shifting from confusion to something else. Realization. Whitmore's mouth opened, then closed. Her smirk was gone, wiped clean from her face. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice suddenly sharp, as if she could still command the situation into submission. "Is this some kind of joke?" Brian shook his head. "No joke, Your Honor." He placed the warrant on the stand, the official seal of the state gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "The Bureau has been investigating you for months," he continued. "Multiple cases dismissed in exchange for financial kickbacks, defense attorneys lining their pockets while you walked free. You thought no one was paying attention." Whitmore's breathing quickened. She turned sharply toward the prosecution table. "Ms. Lawson," she snapped at the ADA, "I assume you have something to say about this nonsense?" The ADA met her gaze. Then slowly she leaned forward, resting her hands on the table. "I do," she said, and then she flipped open a folder. Inside were pages, stacks of them. Case files, bank transactions, testimonies, a paper trail so thick it could bury a career. Whitmore's career. Her face twisted, shifting from anger to something else. Panic. "You can't do this," she hissed. "You don't have jurisdiction." Brian lifted his badge slightly. "Actually, I do. I was assigned to this case as an undercover investigator. My testimony today? It wasn't about the drug case." He let the words sink in. "It was about you." Whitmore's breath hitched. For years, she had ruled this courtroom, untouchable, her word law. She had humiliated people, torn them down, dismissed their lives like they were inconveniences. And now, the same system she had manipulated had turned its eyes on her. She slammed her hands on the desk. "This is outrageous," she barked. "You think you can humiliate me in my own courtroom?" Brian took a step forward. "This isn't about humiliation, it's about justice." Her hands clenched into fists. "You have no proof." "The wiretaps say otherwise," Brian cut in. "The bank records, the recorded conversations, the testimonies from attorneys who were more than happy to talk once they realized they were facing charges too." He tilted his head. "You really thought no one would notice, didn't you?" The courtroom had been silent before. Now it felt like it wasn't even breathing. Every eye was locked on Whitmore. For the first time in her career, She wasn't in control, and it was tearing her apart, but it wasn't over yet. Because the real humiliation was about to begin. Whitmore's breathing was shallow now, her eyes darting across the room, looking for an escape. But there was none. Not this time. She turned sharply to the bailiff, the same bailiff who had stood at her side for years, enforcing her orders without question. "Well?" she snapped, desperation creeping into her voice. "Aren't you going to do something?" The bailiff hesitated. His face was unreadable, but Brian saw the moment he made his decision. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped forward. Not toward Brian, toward her. Whitmore took a step back. "No," she muttered, shaking her head. You don't have the authority to." The bailiff ignored her. He unhooked the handcuffs from his belt, her face twisted in disbelief. "I run this courtroom," she shouted, her voice cracking. "You work for me." Brian crossed his arms. "Not anymore." The bailiff moved behind her, and for the first time in her life, Judge Katherine Whitmore felt the cold, unyielding press of steel against her wrists. The click of the cuffs echoed through the courtroom. Gasps. A low murmur. The collective exhale of an audience that had spent years watching her tear people down, only to see her fall in the end. Whitmore's lips trembled. You can't do this to me." Brian sighed. "You did this to yourself." The ADA stood up. "Your Honor." She paused, correcting herself. "Ms. Whitmore, you will be remanded to custody immediately. You will await trial, just like every defendant who has stood in this courtroom before you." Whitmore's knees wobbled. She reached out, gripping the bench for support. "This is a mistake," she whispered. I am the law." Brian shook his head. "No," he said. "You were above the law. That's why you're here now." Whitmore turned wildly to the jury, to the attorneys, to the spectators in the gallery, people who had once cowered under her authority, but none of them moved. None of them spoke for her. Brian watched as reality finally sank in. For the first time in her life, Katherine Whitmore was powerless. The bailiff gave her a small nudge. "Let's go." She stumbled forward. As she was led past the prosecution table, her gaze locked onto Brian's one last time. There was no hatred there anymore, no smugness, only the quiet, suffocating weight of a woman who had just lost everything. Brian held her gaze, unflinching, and then she was gone. The heavy doors swung shut behind her, sealing her fate. For a long moment, no one in the courtroom moved. Then, slowly, the room erupted. Whispers, shaken heads, disbelieving murmurs. Some people laughed, a bitter, almost disbelieving sound. Others just stared at the doors, as if waiting for her to burst back in and demand that the last 5 minutes be erased. Brian turned, making his way toward the exit. Before he reached the door, a man in the gallery, someone he didn't recognize, spoke up. "Detective." Brian paused, glancing over his shoulder. The man gave a small nod. "Took long enough." Brian exhaled. Then he pushed the doors open and stepped into the hallway. But even as he left, he knew this was bigger than just one corrupt judge. There were always more, and the fight for justice wasn't over. Not even close. The courthouse steps were quieter than usual. Reporters were just beginning to catch wind of what had happened inside. Soon, the headlines would spread. The fall of Judge Katherine Whitmore, a woman who had spent years abusing her power, believing she was untouchable. But no one is above justice. Brian Foster knew that better than anyone. As he stepped outside, he took a deep breath. The air felt different, lighter. But he also knew this wasn't the end. For every corrupt judge, there was another waiting in the shadows. For every wrongful conviction, there was another case slipping through the cracks. One victory didn't mean the fight was over. It never was. But today, at least, the system had worked the way it was supposed to. and that was worth something. Power doesn't make someone untouchable. It just makes their fall that much harder when justice finally comes knocking. People like Katherine Whitmore think they can bend the rules, twist the law in their favor, and never face the consequences. But the truth? The truth always comes out. It might take time. It might take patience. But corruption, arrogance, and abuse of power can only go so far before it all collapses. A question for you. How many more people like Whitmore are out there? How many times have you seen someone get away with something they shouldn't have? And more importantly, what are we going to do about it? If you believe in accountability, in standing up for what's right, then don't just sit back and watch. Speak up, stay informed, demand better. Because justice isn't automatic. It's something we have to fight for. And when we do, even the mighty will fall.